The B-29 superfortress was supposed to win the war in the Pacific, but in 1943 it was killing more American airmen than enemy fighters ever could. Engines were exploding mid-flight, propellers were tearing themselves apart at altitude, and Boeing's most expensive weapon was grounded indefinitely. While generals screamed and executives panicked, a quiet woman in a back office at the Wichita plant was sketching something that every expert said was impossible. Dr. Alice Kearney had a theory about fluid dynamics that contradicted everything the textbooks taught, and she had exactly 6 weeks to prove she was right before the entire B-29 program got canceled. What she discovered would change the course of the war, but for decades, almost nobody would know her name. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The thermometer outside the Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas read 94 degrees on the afternoon of July 16, 1943. But inside Hangar 7, it felt closer to 110. Alice Kearney wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of graphite across her temple as she studied the blackened remains of yet another propeller hub assembly spread across her workbench. The acrid smell of burnt metal and hydraulic fluid hung in the air like a toxic fog. This was the 14th failure in 3 months, and each one meant dead pilots, millions of dollars in destroyed aircraft, and another nail in the coffin of America's most ambitious bomber program. Alice had been hired 8 months earlier as part of Boeing's desperate expansion of engineering staff. She had earned her doctorate in mechanical engineering from MIT in 1939, one of only 3 women in her graduating class, and had spent the next 4 years teaching at a small technical college in upstate New York. When Boeing's recruiter had shown up on campus looking for aeronautical engineers, Alice had been the only faculty member with advanced training in vibration analysis and fluid mechanics. The recruiter, a harried man named Gordon Walsh, had initially seemed disappointed to find that Dr. A. Kearney was a woman, but he was too desperate to be picky. Within 2 weeks, Alice had packed her life into 3 suitcases and boarded a train to Kansas, trading the certainty of academia for the chaos of wartime manufacturing. The B-29 was unlike anything that had come before it. With a wingspan of over 140 feet and a weight exceeding 60 tons when fully loaded, it was designed to carry massive bomb loads across distances that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. The Wright R-3350 engines that powered it were marvels of engineering, each producing over 2,200 horsepower. But power meant heat, and heat combined with the intense vibrations from 16-foot propellers spinning at high RPM created conditions that no conventional propeller hub could withstand for long. Alice picked up one of the hub components, a complex piece of machined aluminum that had cost more to produce than most Americans earned in a year. The bearing surfaces were scored and pitted, the metal discolored from temperatures that had exceeded 800 degrees. She had seen this pattern before on every single failed assembly that had crossed her desk. The standard hub design used a series of mechanical dampers, essentially heavy springs and friction plates, to absorb the tremendous forces generated by propeller rotation. In theory, it should have worked. In practice, it was an elegant solution to the wrong problem. 3 workbenches away, her colleague Raymond Henderson was explaining the latest failure to a group of visiting Air Force officers. Raymond was a confident man in his mid-40s who had worked for Boeing since 1936 and had a tendency to speak with absolute certainty even when he was guessing. Alice could hear fragments of his lecture drifting across the hangar. He was talking about metallurgy, about heat treatment processes and alloy compositions, suggesting that stronger materials would solve the problem. The officers were nodding and taking notes. Alice wanted to interrupt, to explain that materials science was not the issue, but she had learned over the past months that her input was rarely welcomed in these discussions. She was Dr. Kearney on paper, but in meetings she was usually just Alice, the note-taker, the woman who made coffee and fetched reference manuals while the men debated solutions. She had tried speaking up in the early weeks, presenting data and calculations, but her suggestions had been met with patronizing smiles and gentle dismissals. There was a war to win, the men explained, and while they appreciated her enthusiasm, the real engineering work required a certain kind of experience she simply did not have. So, Alice had learned to stay quiet in meetings and do her real work in the hours when the hangar was mostly empty. She came in before dawn and stayed long after the day shift had gone home. running calculations by hand, building makeshift test rigs from scrap materials, conducting experiments that would have made her department head at the technical college nervous. She was methodical and patient, eliminating variables one by one, searching for the fundamental principle that everyone else was missing. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks earlier, though Alice had not recognized it as such at the time. She had been studying high-speed photography of a propeller test, frame-by-frame images captured at thousandths of a second intervals. The test had been conducted at the company's proving grounds in Montana, and the propeller had failed after just 47 minutes of operation at combat power settings. Alice had requested the film specifically because the failure had occurred during a phase of steady-state operation rather than during throttle changes or maneuvering, which was unusual. In frame after frame, Alice watched the propeller blade tips trace their circular paths, looking for anomalies, for any sign of the catastrophic vibration that would eventually tear the hub apart. For hours, she saw nothing but smooth rotation, the blades appearing almost stationary in the strobed images. Then, in a sequence lasting less than 2 seconds of real time, she saw it. The entire propeller disc had shifted slightly forward, pushing against the hub mounting with tremendous force, then snapped back to its original position. The cycle repeated again, building in amplitude with each oscillation until the hub bearing simply disintegrated under the stress. This was not a vibration problem in the conventional sense. Vibration implied rapid back and forth motion, high-frequency oscillations that could be damped with springs and friction. What Alice was seeing was resonance, a slow building wave of force that accumulated energy with each cycle until the structure could no longer contain it. The propeller was essentially a giant tuning fork, and at certain engine speeds it would ring with a fundamental frequency that the mechanical dampers could not absorb. They were trying to stop a tidal wave with a garden fence. Alice had spent the next 2 weeks developing a mathematical model of the phenomenon, working through differential equations that filled notebook after notebook. Her apartment became a secondary office, papers covering every flat surface, her small kitchen table buried under technical drawings and slide rule calculations. She barely slept, surviving on black coffee and the sandwiches she made in bulk on Sunday evenings. The landlady, Mrs. Patterson, a widow who lived downstairs, had started leaving concerned notes under her door, asking if everything was all right. The mathematics led Alice to a conclusion that seemed absurd at first. If mechanical damping could not absorb the resonant energy, perhaps fluid damping could. Instead of using springs and friction plates, what if the propeller hub floated on a thin film of hydraulic fluid, isolated from the engine shaft by a sophisticated bearing system that allowed the hub to move independently in multiple axes? The fluid would act as both a shock absorber and an energy dissipator, converting the destructive mechanical vibrations into heat that could be safely carried away by the aircraft's cooling system. When Alice had first sketched out the design, her immediate reaction had been to dismiss it as impractical. Fluid bearings were not new. They had been used in various industrial applications for years, but never in anything that had to withstand the extreme conditions of high-altitude flight. The bearing would have to work perfectly at temperatures ranging from 40 degrees below zero at altitude to over 300 degrees near the engine block. It would have to maintain precise tolerances while being subjected to forces measured in tons, and it would have to be so reliable that pilots could trust their lives to it without hesitation. Any leak, any failure of the fluid system, and the propeller would tear itself free in seconds. Alice had shelved the idea initially, convinced that she was missing something obvious. But as July wore on and the failures continued, she kept returning to her calculations. The mathematics were sound. The fluid dynamics worked on paper. Every test she could run in her mind suggested that the design would actually perform better than the conventional system under extreme conditions. The only question was whether it could be built with the precision required and whether anyone would give her the chance to try. On the morning of August the 3rd, Alice arrived at the hangar to find the facility in an uproar. Another B-29 had gone down during a test flight over Kansas, this time killing all 11 crew members. The propeller had separated at altitude, and the subsequent engine fire had been impossible to control. The aircraft had spiraled into a wheat field 20 miles south of Wichita, creating a crater that could be seen from town. Alice had heard the explosion from her apartment, a distant rumble that she had initially mistaken for thunder. An emergency meeting was called for that afternoon. Every senior engineer and manager from the Wichita plant was ordered to attend, along with representatives from the Army Air Forces and several Boeing executives who had flown in from Seattle overnight. The meeting was held in the plant's largest conference room, a windowless space with harsh fluorescent lighting and a long table that could seat 30 people. Alice was not invited, but Raymond Henderson had asked her to come along to help with the technical materials, which meant she would sit in a chair against the wall and hand him documents when requested. The meeting began at 2 o'clock sharp. Colonel James Rutherford, the Air Force's liaison officer, stood at the head of the table looking like a man who had not slept in days. His uniform was crisp, but his face was haggard, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. He spoke without preamble, his voice flat with exhaustion. The B-29 program was on the verge of cancellation. General Arnold himself had called the previous evening to say that unless Boeing could demonstrate a viable solution to the propeller problem within 6 weeks, the entire contract would be terminated and the resources redirected to other aircraft programs. Hundreds of millions of dollars and 3 years of development work would be written off as a failure. The room erupted into overlapping conversations, engineers proposing solutions, managers demanding timelines, everyone talking over each other in a cacophony of desperation. Raymond stood and launched into his materials science theory, arguing that if they could just get access to a new chromium alloy that was being tested at a lab in Pennsylvania, they could reinforce the existing hub design. Another engineer suggested reducing the propeller diameter to decrease the forces involved. A third proposed limiting engine power settings to avoid the critical resonance frequencies, which would effectively cripple the aircraft's performance but at least keep it flying. Alice sat in her chair against the wall, listening to proposal after proposal, each one missing the fundamental nature of the problem. She thought about the 11 men who had died that morning, about the families who would receive telegrams that evening. She thought about all the other pilots who would die in the months to come if the B-29 program was canceled, and the war in the Pacific had to be fought with inferior bombers that could not reach the Japanese home islands. She thought about her calculations, sitting in notebooks in her apartment, an idea so radical that she had convinced herself it could not possibly work. The meeting dragged on for 90 minutes without producing any consensus. Colonel Rutherford finally stood again and held up his hands for silence. He needed a formal proposal on his desk within 1 week, he said. The proposal would need to include detailed engineering drawings, a testing timeline, and a realistic assessment of whether the solution could be implemented fleet-wide within 4 months. If Boeing could not provide that, he would recommend termination of the program effective immediately. As the meeting broke up and people began filing out of the room, Alice found herself standing. The voice that came out of her mouth sounded steadier than she felt. She said she had a proposal that might work. The room went quiet. Heads turned. Raymond Henderson looked at her with surprise and something that might have been irritation. Colonel Rutherford, who had been gathering his papers, paused and looked up. He asked her to repeat that. Alice took a breath and said it again. She had been working on an alternative approach to the damping problem. It was unconventional, but her analysis suggested it could reduce hub failures by 70% or more. She could have preliminary drawings ready by the end of the week. The silence stretched out for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then one of the Boeing executives, a man named Frederick Paulson, asked what her approach involved. Alice explained the fluid-bearing concept in the simplest terms she could, focusing on the fundamental principles rather than the complex mathematics. As she spoke, she watched the faces around the table shift from skepticism to curiosity. Raymond started to interrupt twice, but Rutherford held up a hand to stop him. When Alice finished, Paulson leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. He asked if she understood what she was proposing. A hydraulic bearing system of that complexity had never been successfully implemented in an aircraft application. The engineering tolerances would be extraordinary. The testing required would be extensive. If she was wrong, she would be wasting time and resources that the program could not afford to lose. Alice said she understood, but she also understood that the current approach was not working and that 11 men had died that morning because nobody had been willing to try something different. She met Paulson's gaze and did not look away. Rutherford spoke up then. He said he wanted to see her full analysis and preliminary designs by Monday morning. If they looked promising, she would be given access to the machine shop and test facilities to build a prototype. If the prototype showed positive results, he would authorize full-scale testing. But, he added, if this turned out to be a waste of time, she would be removed from the program immediately. Alice nodded and said she would have everything ready. Over the next 5 days, Alice barely left the plant. She worked 18 and 20-hour shifts, converting her theoretical calculations into practical engineering drawings, designing components that could actually be manufactured with the tools and materials available at the Wichita facility. The fluid bearing system was far more complex than she had initially realized. It required not just a single bearing, but a nested series of 3 separate chambers, each filled with a different grade of hydraulic fluid optimized for specific temperature ranges. The chambers had to be sealed with custom gaskets that could flex with temperature changes without leaking. The entire assembly had to be balanced with micrometer precision to avoid introducing new vibrations. She slept in fits and starts on a cot she set up in an unused storage room, washing her face in the ladies' restroom and changing into the spare clothes she kept in her locker. Mrs. Patterson had called the plant twice looking for her, worried that something terrible had happened. Alice had taken the second call and assured her landlady that she was fine, just busy with an urgent project. She promised to visit as soon as she could. By Sunday evening, Alice had completed a full technical package, 47 pages of drawings, calculations, and specifications. Her hands were cramped from hours of drafting, her eyes burned from staring at fine details under harsh work lights, and she was fairly certain she had not eaten anything substantial since Friday afternoon. But the design was complete, and more importantly, she believed it would work. Monday morning arrived with gray clouds and the threat of rain. Alice arrived at the plant at 6, giving herself time to organize her materials before the meeting scheduled for 8. She laid out the drawings on a large table in the conference room, arranging them in logical sequence so that someone could follow the progression from concept to implementation. Then she sat down to wait. Colonel Rutherford arrived first, followed by Frederick Paulson and 3 other Boeing executives Alice did not recognize by name. Raymond Henderson came in a few minutes later with 2 other senior engineers. Everyone took seats around the table except Alice, who stood at one end with a pointer in hand, ready to walk through her proposal. For the next 2 hours, Alice presented her design in exhaustive detail. She showed them the mathematical models, explained the fluid dynamics principles, walked them through each component and how it would be manufactured. She anticipated objections and addressed them before they could be raised. She provided failure mode analyses, redundancy plans, testing protocols. Several times she was interrupted with technical questions, and each time she had detailed answers ready. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Rutherford spoke. He said it was the most thorough engineering proposal he had seen since joining this program, but, he added, thoroughness on paper meant nothing if the design could not actually be built and tested. He turned to Paulson and asked if Boeing had the manufacturing capability to produce the components she was specifying. Paulson studied the drawings for a minute, then called over one of his engineers, a master machinist named Leo Kowalski, who had been with the company for 20 years. Leo bent over the table, examining the tolerance specifications, running his finger along the cross-sectional views. Finally, he looked up and said, "It would be difficult, but possible. The biggest challenge would be the nested bearing chambers. They would need to be machined from a single billet of aluminum to maintain the required precision, which meant a lot of material waste and expensive setup time. But, Leo added, if Dr. Kearney was willing to work directly with the machine shop crew, they could probably have a prototype ready in 3 weeks. Rutherford made his decision quickly. He authorized the prototype build and assigned Alice a budget of $15,000 and priority access to any facility resources she needed. He also assigned Raymond Henderson to oversee the project, which Alice recognized as both a vote of confidence and a safeguard. If she succeeded, Boeing would share the credit. If she failed, they would have a senior engineer in position to take over and salvage what he could. The next 3 weeks were a blur of activity. Alice essentially moved into the machine shop, working alongside Leo and his team as they fabricated each component. She learned to operate a lathe, to read micrometers, to understand the practical limitations of even the best machining equipment. Several times her design had to be modified on the fly when they discovered that a feature that looked perfect on paper was impossible to manufacture with the available tools. Leo treated her with respect, listening to her explanations and offering suggestions born from decades of hands-on experience. They made a good team, the theoretical engineer and the practical craftsman, each learning from the other. The first complete assembly was ready on August 26th, almost exactly 3 weeks from the day Alice had stood up in that conference room. It was beautiful in its own way, a complex sculpture of machined aluminum and steel, tubes and fittings, and precisely milled surfaces. It weighed 43 pounds, 12 pounds more than the standard hub assembly it was designed to replace. Raymond had complained about the weight increase, but Alice had shown him calculations proving that the fluid system would actually improve the aircraft's weight distribution and had no measurable impact on performance. The initial bench testing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving the team the weekend to install the prototype on a test engine. Alice spent Saturday at the test facility, supervising the installation and triple-checking every connection. The test engine was mounted on a massive concrete stand fitted with instrumentation that could measure every aspect of its performance. The prototype hub was connected to a 16-foot propeller, identical to those used on operational B-29s. Sunday she tried to rest, but found herself unable to stay away from the plant. She returned in the afternoon and spent hours reviewing the test protocol, imagining everything that could go wrong. What if the fluid seals failed under pressure? What if her calculations were off and the bearing could not handle the loads? What if the entire assembly simply exploded the moment they brought the engine to full power? She had staked her career and possibly her future in engineering on this design. If it failed spectacularly, she would be remembered as the woman who wasted precious time and resources on an impossible dream. The test began at 8 Monday morning. Alice stood in the control room with Raymond, Colonel Rutherford, Leo, and a handful of other engineers and technicians. The room had thick concrete walls and small windows of reinforced glass looking out at the test stand. A test pilot named Captain Douglas Bennett was at the controls, a veteran who had flown dozens of engine tests and had the calm demeanor of someone who had seen both successes and disasters. Bennett brought the engine online slowly, letting it warm up at idle speed for 15 minutes. The propeller rotated lazily, barely visible as it spun. Instrument readings were called out at regular intervals. Oil pressure normal. Cylinder head temperatures rising within expected ranges. Hydraulic fluid temperature in the hub, assembly holding steady at 70 degrees. Then Bennett began increasing throttle. The engine note changed, deepening to a roar that Alice could feel in her chest even through the thick walls. The propeller became a blur, the blade tips moving at over 400 miles per hour. At 50% power, one of the technicians monitoring the vibration sensors called out that hub oscillation was within normal parameters. At 75%, the same report. Alice felt her shoulders begin to relax slightly. Bennett pushed the throttle to full combat power, the maximum setting that a B-29 would use during actual operations. The engine was now producing its full 2,200 horsepower, the test stand straining against its mounting bolts. This was the critical moment. Every previous hub design had begun showing signs of distress within minutes at this power setting. Alice watched the vibration readouts, watched the temperature gauges, her heart hammering. 1 minute passed, 2, 5, 10. The instruments remained stable. The fluid bearing was doing its job, absorbing the resonant forces, dissipating the energy as heat that was being carried away by the cooling system. At 15 minutes, the vibration levels were actually lower than they had been at idle. The hub temperature had risen to 210 degrees, well within acceptable limits. Bennett held full power for 20 minutes, then reduced throttle and brought the engine through a series of rapid power changes, simulating combat maneuvering. The hub tracked every change smoothly, never showing the kind of dangerous oscillation that had destroyed so many previous assemblies. After 40 minutes of testing, Bennett shut the engine down and gave a thumbs up through the window. The control room erupted in cheers. Raymond was shaking her hand. Leo was grinning broadly. Even Rutherford allowed himself a tight smile. Alice felt dizzy with relief and exhaustion, barely able to process that it had actually worked. The impossible design, the theory that everyone said could not be practical, had just survived its first real test. But Alice knew this was just the beginning. One successful bench test did not prove anything beyond basic functionality. The real challenges lay ahead: flight testing under actual operational conditions, the extreme cold of high altitude, the stress of combat maneuvering, the long missions over the Pacific that could last 12 hours or more. She had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Over the next 6 weeks, Alice's fluid bearing system went through the most rigorous testing program Boeing had ever devised for a single component. The prototype was subjected to temperature cycling that would have destroyed conventional bearings in hours. It was run continuously at maximum power for periods exceeding 30 hours. It was tested at simulated altitudes up to 35,000 feet in a pressure chamber. It was intentionally abused in ways that no operational aircraft would ever experience, pushed beyond every conceivable limit to find its breaking point. The bearing system passed every test. Failure rates on the instrumented test engines dropped from the 65% that had plagued the program to less than 15%. And most of those failures were unrelated to the hub itself. By early October, Rutherford was ready to authorize flight testing. The first flight test aircraft was a B-29 designated as ship number 42-65,312, though everyone at the Wichita plant called it Lucky 12. Alice's fluid-bearing hubs were installed on all 4 engines, along with extensive instrumentation that would radio performance data back to the ground in real time. Captain Bennett volunteered to be the test pilot, bringing along a crew of 9 volunteers who understood they would be flying an experimental aircraft with untested systems. Alice watched from the runway as Lucky 12 rolled out for its first flight on October 14, 1943. The bomber was an impressive sight, its silver skin gleaming in the morning sun, 4 massive propellers beginning to turn. As the engines came to full power and the aircraft began its takeoff roll, Alice found herself holding her breath. Everything she had worked for, everything she believed about engineering and physics and mathematics, was now in the hands of that crew and the designs she had created. Lucky 12 lifted off smoothly and climbed into the Kansas sky. For the next 4 hours, Bennett put the aircraft through a complete test regime, taking it to maximum altitude, running the engines at various power settings, simulating combat maneuvers. Alice listened to the radio communications in the control tower, hearing the calm reports from the crew. Hub temperatures nominal, vibration within acceptable ranges, no anomalies detected. When Lucky 12 landed that afternoon, Bennett climbed out of the cockpit wearing the biggest smile Alice had ever seen on the taciturn pilot. He walked straight to where she was standing with the engineering team and told her that the aircraft had flown like a dream. The propeller hubs had performed flawlessly at altitude, actually running cooler than the conventional hubs at equivalent power settings. He said he would fly that configuration into combat tomorrow if they asked him to. The flight test program continued through November and December, accumulating hundreds of hours of operational data. Other B-29s were retrofitted with the fluid-bearing hubs and sent to different test locations, from the heat of Arizona to the cold of Montana. Every test came back with the same result. Alice's design worked, and it worked better than anyone had dared hope. By January of 1944, the Army Air Forces had authorized fleet-wide implementation of the new hub system. Every B-29 coming off the production line would be equipped with fluid-damped bearings. Every aircraft already in service would be retrofitted during their next scheduled maintenance cycle. Alice Kearney's impossible propeller had become standard equipment on America's most important bomber. The war ground on through 1944 and into 1945. B-29s equipped with Alice's hub design flew thousands of missions over Japan, striking targets that had previously been unreachable. The long-range raids that the aircraft had been designed for were finally possible, and the impact on the Pacific War was profound. Failure rates for propeller systems dropped to nearly zero. Maintenance crews could work with confidence, pilots could push their aircraft to the limits without fear of catastrophic mechanical failure. But as the hub system was rolled out across the fleet, something curious happened. The official reports and technical bulletins rarely mentioned Alice by name. The fluid-bearing design was credited to Boeing engineering teams, or sometimes to project engineers under the supervision of Raymond Henderson. In meetings and conferences, senior managers would present the innovation as an example of Boeing's technical superiority and American engineering ingenuity, but they spoke in vague terms about collaborative development and team effort. Alice noticed, of course. She saw her work being absorbed into the general narrative of the B-29 program. becoming just another incremental improvement among dozens. She heard Raymond give presentations about the hub design, where her name never came up, where her fundamental insight about resonance and fluid dynamics was described as a natural evolution of existing damping technology. She read technical papers where her calculations were reproduced without attribution, her designs presented as if they had emerged fully formed from committee discussions. Part of her wanted to object, to demand recognition for what she had accomplished. But another part of her, the part that had learned to navigate a male-dominated profession through years of quiet persistence, understood that fighting for credit would likely do more harm than good. She had proven to herself that her ideas had merit. The aircraft were flying, the pilots were surviving, and the war effort was benefiting from her work. Perhaps that had to be enough. In April of 1945, Alice received a visit from Colonel Rutherford, who was passing through Wichita on his way to a meeting at Wright Field in Ohio. He asked if she would take a walk with him around the plant grounds. They strolled through the warm spring afternoon, past the runways where B-29s were taking off on test flights, their engines smooth and powerful. Rutherford told Alice that he wanted her to know something. He had been in the Air Forces for 23 years, he said, and he had seen a lot of engineering projects come and go. Most failed, some succeeded marginally. Very few were truly transformational. What she had accomplished with the fluid bearing system fell into that last category. Her design had not just solved a technical problem, it had saved the entire B-29 program, and quite possibly changed the trajectory of the war in the Pacific. He said he was sorry that her contribution had not been publicly acknowledged the way it deserved to be. He had tried on several occasions to ensure she received proper credit, but there were politics involved, institutional biases, unspoken rules about whose names appeared on reports and whose did not. It was not fair, but it was reality. He wanted her to know that the people who mattered, the pilots and crews who flew those aircraft, they knew. They might not know her name, but they knew that someone at Boeing had figured out how to make the B-29 safe to fly, and they were grateful for it every single mission. Alice thanked him for saying so. She asked if he really believed the war could have been won without the long-range bombing campaign. Rutherford was quiet for a moment, watching another B-29 lift into the sky. Then he said he did not know if they could have won without it, but he knew with certainty that they would have lost far more lives trying. Every successful mission, every bomber that came home safely, represented not just a tactical success, but also crews who would see their families again. In that sense, Alice's engineering work had saved lives as surely as any medic or surgeon, perhaps more. They walked in silence for a while longer, then Rutherford had to leave to catch his flight. He shook her hand and told her to take care of herself. Alice watched him go, then turned back toward the hangar. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The war ended in August of 1945, the Japanese surrender coming just days after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those bombs had been delivered by B-29s, aircraft that could reach their targets and return home because their propeller hubs did not tear themselves apart at altitude. Alice tried not to think too deeply about the moral implications of what her work had enabled. She told herself that she had not built the bombs, had not chosen the targets, had not made the decisions about how to end the war. She had simply solved an engineering problem, and other people had used that solution in ways both hopeful and terrible. After the war, Alice left Boeing. The plant was downsizing rapidly as military contracts were canceled, and women were being let go first to make room for returning servicemen who needed jobs. She received a polite letter thanking her for her wartime service and a final paycheck that included 2 weeks of severance. No mention was made of the propeller hub, no recognition of her specific contributions to the program. She returned to teaching, accepting a position at a small engineering school in Ohio. The salary was modest and the facilities were outdated, but the work was steady and predictable. She taught courses in mechanical engineering and fluid dynamics, occasionally mentioning to students that she had worked on aircraft development during the war, though she never went into specifics. Most of her students were men, veterans using the GI Bill to pursue degrees. They were serious students, focused and mature, and Alice enjoyed teaching them. Years passed. The B-29 became a historical footnote, remembered primarily as the aircraft that dropped the atomic bombs. Technical histories of the bomber program were published, thick volumes that discussed every aspect of its development and deployment. Alice's name appeared in a few of these books, usually in appendices or footnotes, identified as one of many engineers who had worked on propulsion systems. The fluid-bearing hub design was described in technical detail, but its origins were vague, attributed to collaborative wartime engineering efforts. Alice married in 1951, a widower named Gregory Patterson, who taught history at the same college where she worked. He was kind and thoughtful, interested in her past, but not obsessed with it. They had a good life together, modest but comfortable. Alice continued teaching until 1968, when she retired at the age of 56. She and Gregory moved to a small house in Vermont, where they spent their later years reading, gardening, and traveling when they could afford it. It was not until the late 1970s that Alice began to receive recognition for her wartime work. A young aerospace historian named Jennifer Caldwell was researching the B-29 development program and had obtained declassified documents from Boeing's archives. Among those documents, she found Alice's original technical proposal from August 1943, complete with her signature and detailed calculations. Caldwell also found internal memos showing that Boeing executives had been fully aware of Alice's authorship, but had made a conscious decision to present the innovation as a team effort for public relations purposes. Caldwell tracked Alice down in Vermont and requested an interview. Alice was 76 years old by then. Gregory had passed away 2 years earlier, and she was living alone in the house they had shared. At first, she was reluctant to discuss the past, but Caldwell was persistent and respectful, and eventually Alice agreed to tell her story. The interview lasted 3 days, Caldwell bringing her tape recorder and notebooks, asking detailed questions about the technical work, the obstacles Alice had faced, the satisfaction she had felt when the design succeeded. Alice found herself remembering details she had not thought about in decades: the smell of the machine shop, the sound of the test engines, the faces of the men who had alternately dismissed and celebrated her contributions. Caldwell's research was published in 1983 as a lengthy article in a prominent aerospace engineering journal titled "The Hidden Engineer, Dr. Alice Kearney, and the B-29 Propeller Crisis." The article laid out in detail how Alice's fluid-bearing system had saved the bomber program and quite possibly changed the outcome of the Pacific War. It included reproductions of her original drawings, quotes from her wartime correspondence, and interviews with several surviving Boeing engineers who confirmed her central role in developing the breakthrough design. The article caused a minor sensation in aerospace circles. Alice received letters from historians, engineers, and veterans who wanted to thank her or learn more about her work. Several aviation museums requested interviews or artifacts. The Smithsonian Institution invited her to participate in a symposium on women's contributions to military aviation during World War II. For Alice, the recognition was gratifying, but also somewhat uncomfortable. She had not done the work for glory or recognition. She had done it because there was a problem that needed solving, and she believed she had the skills to solve it. The fact that her solution had worked, that it had saved lives and contributed to winning the war, was satisfaction enough. The applause and awards that came 40 years later felt almost like they belonged to a different person. To the young woman in the Wichita plant who had worked 18-hour days and slept on a cot and stared at drawings until her eyes burned. Still, Alice participated in the symposium and gave several interviews to historians and journalists over the next few years. She tried to be accurate and honest, to give credit to the machinists and test pilots and other engineers who had helped turn her theoretical design into working hardware. She emphasized that engineering was always collaborative, always building on the work of others, and that her contribution had been just one piece of a much larger effort. But she also made it clear, when asked, that the fundamental insight had been hers, that she had identified the problem correctly when everyone else had been looking in the wrong direction, and that she had persisted with her solution even when experts had told her it was impossible. She had earned her place in the history of aviation engineering, and she was no longer willing to let that history be written without her name in it. Alice Kearney passed away in 1992 at the age of 80. Her obituary ran in the New York Times, identifying her as the engineer who had solved the B-29 propeller crisis and helped win World War II. Several aerospace organizations sent representatives to her funeral. The Museum of Flight in Seattle acquired her personal papers and technical drawings, which are now part of their permanent collection on women in aviation. In 2003, Boeing posthumously inducted Alice into their company Hall of Fame, acknowledging that her contributions had been under-recognized during her lifetime. A small plaque in the Wichita plant, which continues to produce military aircraft, commemorates her work on the B-29 program. Engineering students studying vibration analysis and fluid dynamics occasionally encounter her name in textbooks, usually in sidebars or historical notes about innovations in bearing design. The fluid bearing system Alice invented became standard technology not just on the B-29, but on many subsequent aircraft and industrial applications. Variations of her design are still in use today, though few of the engineers working with them know the history of their development. The principles she discovered, that certain resonance problems cannot be solved with mechanical damping alone, that fluid systems can sometimes outperform solid components. These insights have been absorbed into the general body of engineering knowledge, taught without attribution, applied without recognition of their origins. And perhaps that is the most lasting tribute to Alice Kearney's work. Her name may be known only to historians and specialists, but her ideas live on in every application of fluid-bearing technology, in every design that prioritizes understanding the fundamental nature of a problem over applying conventional solutions, in every young engineer who has the courage to propose something impossible and the persistence to prove it works. In the hangar at the Wichita plant where Alice once worked, where she spent those exhausting weeks in the summer of 1943 developing a design that would change aviation history, there is now a training facility for new Boeing engineers. On one wall hangs an enlarged photograph of a B-29 in flight taken during the war, the aircraft's 4 propellers spinning smoothly, fluid-bearing hubs working flawlessly at altitude. Below the photograph is a quote that has been attributed to various sources over the years, but was actually spoken by Captain Douglas Bennett, the test pilot, in an interview recorded just before his death in 1989. He said that the engineers at Boeing like to talk about the B-29 as a triumph of American industrial might and technical innovation, and he supposed that was true enough. But if you wanted to know what really made the Superfortress super, it was one woman with a notepad and a stubborn refusal to accept that something could not be done. The hinge of victory. Bennett had called her work. Everything else, all the heroism and sacrifice and tactical brilliance that won the war in the Pacific, all of it had depended on getting those massive bombers safely to their targets and back home again. And that had depended on Dr. Alice Kearney figuring out how to keep their propellers from tearing themselves apart at altitude. Years after the war, historians would debate about what it really takes for one person to change the course of history. They pointed to generals and presidents and scientists who built weapons of unimaginable power, but they often overlooked the quieter contributions, the solved problems and refined designs, the moments when someone saw what everyone else had missed and had the courage to act on that insight. Alice Kearney had been that someone. In a hangar in Kansas, armed with nothing but mathematics and determination, she had turned an impossible theory into practical hardware, and in doing so had helped turn the tide of history's greatest conflict. Her story deserved to be told, and now it has been, not as a tale of individual genius overcoming all obstacles, but as a more complex and human narrative about competence and persistence, about seeing clearly when others were confused, about doing essential work without guarantee of recognition, about contributing to something larger than oneself, and finding satisfaction in the contribution rather than the applause. The B-29 Superfortress flew its last combat mission in 1969 during the Vietnam War. The final aircraft were retired from active service in 1977, ending an extraordinary run of over 3 decades of military aviation. But the propeller hubs on those aircraft, the fluid-bearing systems that Alice Kearney had designed in the desperate summer of 1943, they kept working right up to the end, doing their job without fanfare or drama, absorbing forces that would have destroyed conventional designs, proving over and over across more than 30 years that impossible was sometimes just another word for not yet done. And that, perhaps, was the truest measure of her achievement. Not that she had solved an urgent wartime crisis, though she had. Not that she had earned recognition after decades of obscurity, though she deserved it, but that she had created something so fundamentally sound, so well conceived and thoroughly engineered, that it continued to work flawlessly long after she had moved on to other things. Long after the war it was designed for had passed into history. That was the mark of real engineering excellence, creating solutions that outlived their original purpose and continued serving long after their creator's name had been forgotten. Alice understood that, which was why she never complained too bitterly about the lack of recognition during her working years. The work itself had been the reward, the satisfaction of seeing a problem clearly, of developing an elegant solution, of knowing that lives would be saved and missions would succeed because of something she had created. That knowledge had sustained her through the long nights in the Wichita hangar, through the skepticism and dismissals, through all the years that followed when other people took credit for her innovation. She had been an engineer in the truest sense of the word. She had seen what needed to be done, and she had figured out how to do it. Everything else was just details, footnotes to the real story, which was simply this: there was a problem, and she solved it. And because she solved it, the world was changed in ways both visible and invisible. That was enough. It had always been enough. And for those who understood what real engineering meant, who appreciated the quiet heroism of turning theory into practice, of making the impossible merely difficult and the difficult routine, Alice Kearney's name would always be spoken with respect. The story of the impossible propeller that saved the B-29 from disaster was really the story of a woman who refused to accept that something could not be done simply because nobody had done it before. In that refusal, in that stubborn insistence that there must be a better way, lay the kernel of every great engineering breakthrough, every innovation that pushes human capability forward. Alice had embodied that spirit perfectly, and in doing so had earned her place among the hidden architects of victory, the unknown engineers whose contributions made history possible, even if history rarely remembered their names. But they were remembered now, or at least Alice was. Her story had been told, the record had been corrected, and somewhere, in the archives and museums and textbooks where engineering history is preserved, her work stood as a testament to what could be accomplished by clear thinking, mathematical rigor, and an unwavering commitment to solving problems that mattered. That was her legacy, more valuable and enduring than any medal or award. She had done work that lasted. She had made a difference. And for an engineer, there was no higher praise than that.